What the heck was that, huh? How about the limit of tertian harmony? Hi, my name's Hsiao. I'm a musician, singer-songwriter, educator, general miscreant. And today I wanted to dive into a topic very, very important to me, vertical harmony. Over the years, I've come up with my own ideas about harmony that I think are pretty cool. And yeah, I've kind of had this idea that maybe it'd be worth kind of putting them out there at some point. And I don't know, I just kind of felt like maybe now would be the right time. Preface before anything, of course, these are just my ideas on how I think this stuff works. It's, of course, not necessarily proven. I'm not saying it's all true or whatnot. I think the coolest thing that could happen would be maybe some, I don't know, discussion, dialogue about where people might think I'm right, where people might think I'm wrong. But anyway, yeah, just kind of thought it was time to put this out there. To start us out, I think I should probably define first what I mean by vertical harmony. I would say I've studied a good amount of theory and harmony, but looking back, I would say that I don't feel like there's often a clear distinction on what I would call the two parts of harmony in a horizontal sense and a vertical sense. So I forget when I started thinking this kind of way, but just breaking that down first, I think is helpful. So horizontal harmony is going to be the aspects concerned with motion, progression, and function from left to right. Think chord progressions, which chord can go to which chord, diatonic relationships and function, etc. So that's all great, of course. There's plenty in that side of harmony that I love. But when I say I'm like a harmony guy, it's more so vertical harmony. So vertical harmony is the other aspect concerned with looking at a structure in isolation and being able to understand the quality, what to name it, and the theory behind it. Think chord quality as in major, minor, etc. Extensions, how high can we make a chord go, whatnot. What is this chord? What does it sound like? And once again, when trying to think vertically, it's best to look at one chord at a time in isolation, removed from the context, what comes before it, what after it. So yeah, pretty much as soon as I started learning about music, I realized pretty quickly I was obsessed with vertical harmony. I would literally, start learning new chords and just playing them or just hearing specific chords would start to give me goosebumps. So what did this look like? I would take a chord I just discovered, let's say major 7, and just kind of go crazy with it on the piano. Play it in all 12 keys, revoice it. Etc. A lot of the early stuff I'd write at the time would just be a bunch of major 7 chords, for example. This would go on and on until eventually I get bored of it. I would then stumble onto a new chord sound, probably major 6/9 was the one after that. And then this process would repeat over and over again. I would say each new chord would bring a new phase of harmony for me where I'd be obsessed with that one sound for a while until I kind of got bored of it and then just keep moving on. Pretty much when I look back, I think I did have chord phases for every kind of extended chord quality type. So anyway, just trying to say the reason I'm even making this video is because, over the years, I love and have loved vertical harmony. It's been the aspect of music that I'd say I've chased the most over the years. So to get to how I currently think about vertical harmony, I'll start with how I was originally taught. Coming from a jazz harmony education context, I'd say the way vertical harmony is taught can be broken down into a few specific topics. First thing would be learning all the different chord types out there. First being all the different types of triads. So all the different triad types, we have major, minor, diminished, augmented, and then sus. I am going to include sus on this list of triad types, even though I was personally introduced to sus in a different context first. And I do think it's a place where some people might potentially disagree on, but I think overall it's pretty accepted to think of a sus4 chord as a basic triadic type structure. After triad, it's learning all the 7th chord extensions after that. So major 7, dominant 7, minor 7, minor 7 flat 5, fully diminished, and 7 sus, etc. And then after that, yeah, it's learning what all of the, acceptable extensions are, for each flavor. So, 9s, 13s, sharp 11. Dominance is cool. You learn about altered dominance, of course. Symmetrical diminished or double diminished. So yeah, just learning all the different qualities of chords that can exist. Second topic that's introduced is the idea of voicings. Now, I don't really even remember 100% how I was formally taught about voicings earlier on. And I think that's because the general principle is an easy thing to understand, and I was probably taught it when I was younger. The basic idea is to take a chord quality that you do know, and looking at it in a root position, stacked thirds above the root, and then just taking the notes of that chord and moving them to different places to get a different sound. For a while, I don't think it got much more complicated than that idea of it, but eventually in college I was introduced to some more specific voicing techniques, and they were coming from an arranging context, like how to come up with different voicings for maybe multiple horns. What's special here is that they started focusing on zooming into the specific intervals involved. So we learned about spread voicings, which are going to be kind of taking advantage more of course, larger spread out intervals. Let's say like root 5th on the bottom, and then 3rd and 7th. You can swap those. Example. So taking that root position and spreading it out a little bit more. 4th voicings were big, taking advantage of that 4th structure. Clusters, taking advantage of tighter intervals, of course. So there's spread voicings, 4th voicings, and clusters. Third topic that's introduced is what's known as inversions. Goddamn, y'all. Inversions are the idea of taking a known chord structure and then taking one of the notes that are above the root and moving it now below that root, taking over the role of lowest note. I can't lie. There was a phase of my life in high school where I really liked slash chords, as they're also called. I thought they made a lot of sense. Here's where sus comes back in. I was introduced to this sound, which is a sus chord, but specifically I was introduced to it as F major 7 over G. Because technically that's true. Beautiful, right? Pretty easy way of explaining this harmonic structure, right? You kind of get a sense of what the voicing looks like also. Makes sense, right? Wrong. Enter minor 7 flat 13. So what was happening was I was starting to hear these specific chords in the music that I was listening to and loving them, really just absolutely loving the sound of them. But they seemed to contradict the rules that I was being taught, mainly this idea of avoid tones. So I'll explain these chords in order. Minor 7 flat 13. So this sound is super, super beautiful. I would say the classic voicing would be this shape. So 1, flat 7, flat 3, flat 13. Just to point out some examples of where you might hear this kind of chord, one would be Hang Gliding by Maria Schneider. Really, I think minor 7 flat 13 is kind of, all over the place in this piece. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I just remember being, just so in love with the sound and rewinding. a lot of moments over and over again. Just for example, this is a part a little bit later in the beginning of the song. So right there, minor 7 flat 13. Here too. Then here. Yeah. More recently, Don't Smile by Sabrina Carpenter. Very cool. Right there. Right there. You know, beautiful. As well, I use it in my own writing. Here it is in my song, Okay, Far Away.
I don't know where to go. Tell me how I should know. Never know where to go.
So I kept hearing the sound, in the music I was listening to, but it took me a long time to actually like zoom in and theorize it. I would just be hearing it and go, ooh, I'm just like in love with that sound. So in this chord, that flat 13 is where people would say that's an avoid tone. A note that may be part of the chord scale, but you would not want to be using it in the chord structure itself. It's kind of not allowed. But then, why does it sound so good? Why does it sound so good? Now, for context, let's see what you would expect available extensions to be on a minor chord. All right, so we have minor, minor 6, minor 7, minor major 7, minor 6 9, minor 9, minor major 9, minor 6 9 with the 11, minor 11, and eventually we get the minor 13. So the only accepted flavor that's taught is natural 13. Flat 13 isn't even something people will, consider on a minor chord. Now, eventually, and I think this, was maybe over a few years or so after I'd already been introduced to the sound, I did start coming across people's explanations of it. And yeah, the usual explanation is a major 9 chord over its third, an inversion. So for example, A flat major 9 over C. Here's where I really started getting mad at the idea of inversions. When I hear this sound, to me, this is like very clearly and obviously a minor chord, a minor based sound. I think the idea of trying to explain this as being a major 9 sound is just really counterintuitive and not reflective of what the chord actually feels like. So it comes first from this feeling and what does it sound like sense. And once I started feeling this way based on this chord, just overall I started to think inversions in general are just kind of a shortcut. They're a tool meant to make understanding chord structures easier for people, but they're not actually representative of what the chord really is. And that's my problem with them. Now, I'm gonna get a little snarky here, but just to argue the point, how hard is it to learn flat 13 on a minor chord as being okay? We spent all this time learning all these available altered extensions on dominant chords, but on minor, it's like, we can't do that. I mean, I just think it's not that hard to include that. And then how about this? Why don't we say E minor over C instead of C major 7? This A flat major 9 over C, why are we choosing it to be an A flat bass chord? Why aren't we calling it a B flat 9 sus over C or an E flat 6 sus over C? I think it's kind of arbitrary. Overall, I've come to think inversions are only employed when we've crossed some kind of threshold of inconvenience. It would be harder and maybe more work to expand our idea of what some available extensions are than to just explain it with some kind of inversion. But anyway, I don't like that. 10 sus. Also super, super beautiful. I would say the classic shape for this would be the 1, 4, flat 7, and then the 10. Some examples of where you might find this, I've seen it more in jazz overall. Hang gliding, again, comes up. This is kind of, I guess, what you'd consider the second solo section, second half of the solo section. There's this long, extended kind of percussive thing, and it just lands on this, long sound of this. And I remember just going nuts the first time I heard this kind of thing. I thought it was so beautiful. One specific big band arrangement of a song comes to mind, Somos Novios by the Afro-Latin Jazz Orchestra. It's a pretty straightforward chart for most of it, but in the very end, yeah, it has this, sus, standard 9 sus structure on the bottom, but then the trumpets land on, technically a D flat triad on top, but you've got that sus on the bottom, 10 up top, beautiful. And then in my own writing, I was actually trying to think, 10 sus, I love the sound. I'm surprised I can't think of more examples where I've used it, but there's an alternative version, 10 sus major 7, where instead of the flat 7, use the major 7. So for example, in my song Live Without You, the very last chord, it has this sus 10, but then with the major 7 in the middle instead.
Sinks filled up to the brim, no one's gone to the gym. Such a waste of a house, there's no point for one spouse. I don't know what to do, teach me how to live without you.
So same story as with the minor 7 flat 13, but I do think I kind of was introduced to it earlier, and kind of more clear on what it was earlier, probably before minor 7 flat 13. I remember being in high school and just kind of hearing the sound, loving it, really just trying and being able to play it and recreate it on the piano. Now, the big disagreement with this chord is between the 4, the sus, and the major 3rd. The old rule is that these two tones cannot coexist at the same time in a chord. You'd have to decide, is this going to be a sus chord with the 3rd as an avoid tone, or vice versa, a major chord with the sus 4 as the avoid tone. But again, sounds great, Now this chord definitely was existing, people were using it, and eventually I would see explanations of it as major add 4, or you could also say sus add 3, for example. But yeah, this idea add just kind of always bothered me. I didn't bring it up before, but similar to inversions, it's another idea to explain a chord where you can just have a structure and then add something in addition to it. But once again, I just kind of find this just kind of unsatisfying. It feels really open-ended. There's that added note is not telling you anything about how what role it's playing in the chord. It's just, we know this part of it, but this whatever. You can put anything in there you want, really. Why don't we say major add 7? I can definitely understand the convenience of it, but once again, I just look at it as a shortcut, just kind of a way to explain something a little bit easier, but I don't think it's communicating what it needs to be communicating. Major 13, sharp 11, sharp 15. Here's a quick one. Not one that I feel like I went crazy for that much or have employed it too much, but I do remember it, there being a phase of me kind of thinking about it and kind of discovering it. So the idea is simple. I like major 13, sharp 11. Can I keep going? To my ear, that natural extension next would be the C sharp. And then, just doing the math on it, what we'd have to call this would be a sharp 15, technically. Can't be a flat 9 since we already have the natural 9 in the structure. So again, I think I found this and enjoyed it. I think I used it in a big band chart in high school once or something. But then I kind of tabled it. It's not often that I go to this, this high in my structures. But I pointed out because overall it's an example of me desiring to go past 13, wanting to just kind of push that boundary a little bit more. Flat 9 voicings. I was introduced to the music of Thad Jones around high school, and a teacher at the time kind of described some of the writing involving wrong note voicings. The idea being you can have chord structures that, are mostly standard, mostly work, but then include maybe a note or more that are just wrong, theoretically. In this context, it's mostly being used to come up with this sound that can be described as crunchy, tense, biting. There's a rub in the sound, etc. Some years later in college, two things happened. So first, I learned about symmetrical diminished or double diminished voicings. And I started to realize that the way Thad got his sound, his really crunchy sound, was coming from that context, having that double diminished structure. And that was cool for me. It gave me an explanation for this chord that was no longer using this wrong note voicing explanation. But then somewhere along the way, I was introduced to the writing of Bob Brookmeyer. And there was this new sound employed, this new super crunchy, super tense sound, even more so than the double diminished thing. And it wasn't that. Now, I remember just kind of being in awe at this writing for a long time and not really being able to figure it out. But eventually, I zoomed in and looked, and it's flat 9s. It's the flat 9 intervals. I love this sound. I thought it was super cool. And I don't even remember being formally taught how, one would explain it. But when it would come up, it is back to this idea of just wrong note voicings. Bob is writing a voicing like this, but then purposefully having that flat 9 interval in a way that's just not theoretically correct. Now, this whole wrong note voicing idea, I didn't really find it that frustrating at the time compared to inversions or the add method. I was actually like, it's okay, it makes sense. But along the way, I did want there to be a better system to conceptualize these structures than just saying they're wrong. So some examples of music that uses this writing, again, the Bob Brookmeyer stuff. So here's an example, Bob Brookmeyer's Willow Weep for Me arrangement at the very beginning. Yeah, so you can look at these structures. There's the flat 9. There. So just kind of moving that shape up. Eventually I was taught about Gil Evans and was told that Bob kind of took this idea from Gil Evans, and then I found in Gil's writing, he is using that flat 9 stuff. So I guess credit-wise, it actually came from Gil Evans first. Maybe he got it somewhere else first, would love to know that history. Here's an example I found in Gil Evans' Maids of Cadiz. Yeah, so technically in the upper voices, this very first note is the only time that flat 9 comes in. There's a lot of tension here, but that's just a major 7, which, still crunchy. But this last structure, so all of this is over this D, and technically we do get this flat 9 over here, And then in my own writing, it is very fun for me, not often, but, sometimes to kind of hide a flat 9 voicing in a sound that You wouldn't expect it to. It's still kind of like a pretty chord, but has this flat 9 interval in there kind of hidden. There's an example of that in my song, Happy Song. So yeah, right there, flat 9. Huh, maybe you didn't know that.
It's already with me. Oh.
So overall, with all these minor 7 flat 13, 10 sus, sharp 15, flat 9 voicings, I found myself just frustrated. There were all these chords that I loved and sound great, but there wasn't really much explanation out there for how they worked theoretically without coming up with these exceptions to the rules and, oftentimes just calling them wrong. So I would say this was over a few years in my undergrad where I was finding and hearing these sounds that I really loved, and they were challenging what I was being taught. And then, it kind of led to this period of deep investigation. I want to credit my friend Mike Stapleton. We met during college and pretty quickly discovered that we kind of had this kinship over harmony together. We shared a lot of similar views on how harmony worked. And ended up kind of going through this period of investigation together in a lot of ways. I don't know, it's funny for me because sometimes it's even like trying to remember exactly the order of what was what, but I don't know, you tell me, what do you kind of remember from that time?
Well, I feel like, it's, man, honestly, like a lot of it, I think you probably showed me a lot of things that I didn't know, or labeled a lot of sounds that I was hearing that I really liked, but didn't actually, like minor 11 chords or something like that, where there's like that really, crunchy, sound. And I was like, oh, I really like that. And I know all the notes that kind of go into it, and I would see it on paper or I'd write it down or something. But I feel like you start, like when I first met you, you were like, oh man, that's a cool minor 11 voicing. And I was like, oh, minor 11 voicing. Like, okay. And then I'd play something else, like a minor 7 flat 13 chord that I, didn't like have a name for in my mind, or didn't label it immediately. It was just like, D, C, F, B flat. And you're like, oh man, nice minor 7 flat 13. I was like, oh, okay, minor 7 flat 13.
Really? I guess to me, when I look back, I don't remember necessarily being like, hey, it's this or whatever. I feel like it was a lot of back and forth, a lot of give and take and like conversation.
Oh, well.
So like
it definitely was.
So like, for example, the way you say it, like I was like, oh, that's a minor 7 flat 13. Like minor 7 flat 13, looking back, I'm trying to remember how we even got there. Honestly, it is hard to remember. And it
was 10 years ago, more than that. It was 10 years plus a few months. So
when I try to remember what do I think was the first time I heard that sound, I think it may have been hang gliding for me, and I didn't know it at the time. I just remember enjoying the music and going nuts. But then when we started talking about it, did we ever talk about hang gliding? Do you remember talking about it?
I remember you talking about it, but at that time I hadn't really knew as much of her music as I do now. I think the first thing I ever heard of hers was Greenpeace, and we definitely talked about that, though I think that was a little bit later on, because that was like Jazz Counterpoint 1 or maybe Jazz Comp 2. I think we didn't start with minor 7 flat 13. I think what happened is, what I have a very good memory of is 13 sus, not even 10 sus, just like starting off with 13 sus. We had a big period where that was the thing. We were kind of in that phase at the same time, and I do think that's maybe what started it.
You're probably right. And it's funny that, do you remember any specific songs, for example?
Well, I remember talking about the Family Guy. A lot of the Family Guy music is kind of how I was also like really big into that, specifically like all like the music from that show.
Well, also now that I think about it, when we talk about sus, Sondheim, when I was trying to think through it at first, Sondheim I think has a lot of sus all over the place for sure. Into the Woods, like the whole thing is just like the sus, and I do remember discovering that together. Well, I guess I knew it before, but talking about together. Maybe that's a place where we started, potentially maybe that's where some of that came from. So like I do remember we were going through this period, and maybe a lot of it was coming into it with we were in certain chord phases. 13 sus makes a lot of sense if we were both going nuts over something like that, for example. That probably would be the right time. So we'd be interested in this kind of chord, and then also talking about the perfect pitch stuff, and just kind of, I feel like we were testing each other a lot. We would kind of do
fully
like,
yeah.
So I feel like that was part of it too. Do you remember talking about being frustrated about the exceptions to the rules, specifically minor 7 flat 13, 10 sus? Like, do you remember being like, well, hey, people are saying that doesn't make sense, but we think it does make a lot of sense? Like,
yeah, I mean, I have pretty specific memories, because once we started talking about it more, and once I decided or realized that I liked the sound of it, it obviously became a big part of my writing at Berkeley. I mean, I think for both of us probably. And to give it a name, I mean, a minor 7 flat 13, I think it just kind of like unleashed a new sound, and a new like way of thinking about. I mean, honestly, I've always viewed it as a minor chord. Like we've talked about that. I mean, I remember specific classes. I mean, it was all the harmony classes. It was like if I did something that was what we would call C minor 7 flat 13, people would say, and it's always the same thing. It's like, well, isn't that just a root or a
major 9 over its third?
Yeah, or whatever, like a root major 7 chord over the 3. And my constant response was, yeah, but I don't hear it as that, and then any teachers would just be like, oh, okay, like, well, that's what it is. So
one thing big that I think we kind of had conversations about together was conceptualizing voicings intervallically. I remember having a transformative period, not necessarily, and maybe even few moments where I think voicings used to be very mystifying to me, or the idea of them. I would kind of learn about, chord qualities and whatever, and I'd play everything at the piano. But I would always be like worried, like, oh, is this going to actually make sense? Is that going to sound right in context? Like, how do voicings work? And I think a lot of that was just like a misconception of how orchestration carries over or whatever. But there was like a lack of like clear, insightful, like, I know what I'm writing and it's going to be this and it feels and sounds like this. And I really think it was like you for sure when it comes to voicings. And looking back, I think it was also technically Berkeley, as much as I don't want to give them credit for what I've learned from there.
Well, the environment we can give credit to, because we were in a learning space.
Well, that, yes, but okay, specifically spread voicings, fourth voicings and clusters. They spend all this unit first talking about drop two and whatever, and I could throw that up. I don't care at all about any of that. But then they do bring up those 3 examples, and it is, I don't think that they did a great job of saying and putting in my brain intervals, but that is what it is. They're teaching you intervallically derived structures for voicings. And I remember, like, I had learned that and I loved those units, but I think it was you who at some point, we're talking about everything. We're talking about harmony and voicings. The idea that the real theory of how to voice something and how to construct a voicing is an understanding and insight of how intervals feel within the structure. How does a second, fourth, and once you start getting that, that's like, I feel like that changed my life in terms of voicings. To me, it seemed like I don't know if you had already come into Berkeley or our discussions feeling that, and then I kind of learned that from you, or if you were forming it while you're Berkeley. But I wonder if some of it comes from being a piano player. Obviously your world is voicings and learning different structures,
100%.
So I think that makes a lot of sense. So beyond general exploration through just listening and trying things out on the piano, I started to dig pretty deep into the theoretical side of this stuff. I wanted a system of harmony that accounted for all these exceptions to the rules that I liked. So I kind of wanted to come up with some new rules. The spreadsheet. The goal for these new rules was to continue with the old system, but kind of modify and extend it along the way to account for these exceptions. So to start, I opened up a spreadsheet and just kind of tried to lay things out based on what I already knew to be true. First, I laid out what was already accepted, building stack thirds, and then seeing where we could go from there. First finding. Any chord is built by stacking thirds above the root. Each slot of these thirds can have 3 flavors: natural, flat, sharp, natural, lowered, raised. Even just going this far pretty quickly, there was one finding that I thought was pretty cool. To me, I would consider flat 7 to be that natural 7 slot. Why do I say this? If we were looking at a major 7 chord, for example, and looking at this major 7, if we were trying to say that this was the default position, lower it a half step, get flat 7 used, of course, so that's all good. But if we were to raise it a half step, we just get, the octave, the 1, the 8 again. But what about what we actually use? It's 6. We have major 6 chords, minor 6 chords, diminished, the double flat 7 is technically the 6th. So if we accept flat 7 as being that default position, raise it up, get major 7, lower it a half step, and we get the 6. Just kind of seemed to make sense to me. Now, continuing with the spreadsheet, only extending up to 13 with these rules allows for 10 sus and minor 7 flat 13 to be accepted. And if we push it up to the 15, we get sharp 15 chords. Now, at the time, I think I was really excited. I was feeling like I was really onto something, and already the problems that I came in with, I was already reaching solutions. So, I was feeling great. But I wanted to keep going. There was a part of me that wanted to see what the full limits of this system could be. On the one hand, there was probably examples of crunchy flat 9 voicings still out there that would need to go further up, to explain them. But also just more theoretically too, like what if I wanted a chord that had all 3 flavors of third in it, all 3 flavors of 7, etc. What if I wanted to be able to name a chord that had all 12 chromatic notes? Second finding. To keep going up to new extensions, I've settled on a pattern that you can think of as stacked dominant 7 structures built off the previous flat 7. So to break it down, you would build this dominant 7th chord, but then on this one, build the next one, and on this one, so forth, until we get back to the C on top. So what is that? Tension 34. I don't know exactly where this came from, and if there's a part of my ideas where someone could really be like, really try to challenge me on them, I'd say it's this. I think it came from a lot of trial and error and just sitting at the piano, trying things out and trying to find some kind of pattern. Overall, the goal was to see how high extensions could go and see what that natural position of each slot would be. Now, what supports this being correct and it not being some other pattern? Well, I started with my givens first. Up to the 11, I could argue is given true in my system. From here, what other discernible pattern can you deduce? In making this video, I also kind of came up with a different angle. Instead of that, stacked dominant 7 things, you can also just think stacked major triads, C, and then when you get to that flat 7, B flat, A flat, G flat, etc. Maybe that's easier to think of it that way. And if we look at it like that, it's kind of creating a pattern of stacked triads that are going down a whole step each time from the previous one. So C, B flat, so kind of like a whole tone pattern. In this way, it's clean. It's an equidistant pattern all the way up. And I don't know, if you're trying to devise a system for harmony, those are kind of parameters that I think you'd want. So, So anyway, kind of a lot, right? Tension 34, When do I actually use this? Why make the effort to have a system like this all the way up there? Sometimes I just be hearing these chords in my head, and they're just so big, and I need them. I need to use them, because my brain, I just be hearing them in my brain. I'm just kidding. Well, I'd say first, the highest reasonable chord I'd say that I probably practically use would be that up to that sharp 15 kind of sound. I think it's still, reasonably usable and not like getting into some crazy territory yet. Second part would be those crispy, crunchy, delicious voicings with a lot of that dissonance in the sound. Now, I'd say in a lot of the music I write, I'm not really trying to get into that sound per se, but for example, if I'm writing for big band or like larger ensembles, especially in that more like arranged jazz context, I actually do have a lot of fun coming up with some very tall, tense structures, taking advantage of that kind of sound. For me, it's not like I'm sitting down and always analyzing, this is the 17th and 19th or something like that. But for me, in my head, having this system exist validates structures like that. They're not wrong. They're just, taller. So it's definitely coming from that Gil Evans, Brookmeyer, flat 9 voicing idea, but just, again, having a name for it and having it be part of the theoretical acceptable rules. Third thing, I would say, given this system, you could look at like 12-tone, atonal, avant-garde music, and be able to take some of that real dissonant stuff and be able to have a name for it, an actual chord structure. I don't think there's people out there who really want to do that per se. I wouldn't, even myself, I'm not really big into that world, but if I wanted to, now I can. And then 4, just overall theoretical security. Even though I may never need to get that high up to 34, I personally like feeling like there's a system that I can use that feels complete and could account for anything I want if I wanted to. Just feels good to me. Now, I wouldn't feel good putting this out there without arguing against myself, pointing out some of the flaws and questions with this system. Over the years, I have found some notable examples where I can't say my system holds true or works better, for sure. Short inversions. First example would be this shorter inversion of A flat over C, for example. Now, under my system, we'd have to call this something like C minor sharp 5, or C minor flat 6 perhaps. And it's funny that I point this one out because before this is the exact example where I was arguing for minor 7 flat 13, but sometimes when I hear this, I think the sound of A flat major rings more true. Even if we add the 9 in there, A flat major 9 over C, but I am hearing more of an A flat bass kind of chord. Now, I don't know. I'm pointing out an example where I don't have an answer yet, but just some loose explorations on it. If I did this instead, moving this E flat to this up here, I hear this more as a C minor, I think, just compared to this closed versus open voicing. So I don't know if that's what that has to do with it. If I move the root all the way down, I think no matter what, definitely hear that as a C minor. So I think octave positioning of the voicing is different. I think the higher I make a voicing, even this one maybe, the higher I make this, I hear that more and more like that A flat major triad rather than the C minor. So this part of it I can't say I have fully thought out. Especially with the octave displacement, I might feel the same way about compound chords or polychords. I think especially polychords built off of just triad structures, you can really hear like triad, triad, triad. But I do think that has to do so much with, the displacement between octaves. Skipped tones. What about chords that aren't including, one of the slots or more along the way? For example, this G, major 7, 5, but no third. Also similarly, there's chords that, have the 9 chord. I've seen questions about G2, G add 2, G sus 2. You can, and people might say this is D over G, for example, too. I can't say I have a great answer for chords like that either. Part of me wonders if maybe a system not based on thirds would work better. Very loose thought on that. So far in my own writing, when I do have something like this, I might want to call it G parentheses 2, 5, 7. That being root, parentheses, everything else. Slot priority in voicings. Usually I wouldn't say that there's a huge issue when it comes to voicings. Generally, let's say you're wondering, is this technically a third or is this a 10? Generally, I'll follow the principle of whatever appears first in the structure is going to take precedence in which slot it belongs to. So in this example, the F is appearing before the E, so we're going to consider that a sus major 7. And in this example, the E is appearing before the F, so we're going to give that precedence. It's going to be a major 11 chord. But here's a weird one. Now, if we were to try to follow my system, because the F is appearing first, we'd want to say that that's technically a sus chord, so we'd have to call it something like sus flat 17. But, otherwise we would just call it a minor 11. And yeah, I can't say that my way would be better. Personally, I do want to, I think I do hear this as a minor chord, a minor 11 chord. There's probably many other examples out there. This is just one. Double root structures. Now, here's a weird one. I feel like I found this structure sometime in middle school when I was just messing around at the piano, and I still just to this day remember it, and just feeling really curious about it. This theory of harmony, and I think all harmony, is built on the idea of there being a single root on the bottom with, everything else being analyzed based on that root. But what if there was a chord with 2 roots happening at the same time? I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's the octave it's in on the piano. I know if I move it up, it feels less and less like that. But, something about this, both this low and this one, and then together, it kind of feels like there's 2 roots happening at the same time. I don't know. Let me know if you think I'm just going crazy. You could just say that this is technically a low sus, but I don't know. Finally, I'd like to just point out that my whole system, again, comes from trying to take what we were already using, the system already in place, and modifying and extending it. But it's worth pointing out that that system is based on stacked thirds. From what I've been taught, and this was a long time ago, this system is called tertian harmony, tertian being thirds. I believe on a sound physics side, I've been told there's a reason thirds sound particularly pleasing to us based on like waveform oscillation and ratios comparing. But I'm not particularly well studied on that front. Because of this, I think it makes sense why our systems have been built on stacked thirds. And I'm not saying I don't want that, but is it truly the best system that there could possibly be? I'm not sure. What about a system based on fourths, fifths? I think, if we made it larger intervals, I don't think it would lead to better results, but it could lead to different options and different frames of looking at things. I don't know. On the reverse, smaller intervals, I've even thought about the idea of like a 12, like a half step based 12 tone harmony system. Some kind of chromatic dot system where every possible note above the root is an option. This could communicate voicing in addition to quality, but would probably be too ridiculous. I mean, by then, just write the chord down on the staff, of course. All right, if you made it this far, thanks for sticking through with me till the end. I've never really put together a video like this before. I'd say, just like music education videos in general have never really been my thing. in general. Also, I know there's an idea that for me, I've held on to harmony and the chords I use as part of my identity as a musician, as a composer, and kind of like a sense of if I start telling people these ideas that I'm somehow losing that identity for myself. But as the years have passed, I just feel like obviously no one owns harmony, no one owns chords. All these sounds that I'm bringing up as examples are chords that people have been using and are continuing to use more and more. It may have felt like I was the one coming up with them at the time, but truly I was just hearing them from other people, of course, too. So anyway, I just feel like on that level, I'm at the point too where, hey, it's not about these chords being my ideas, but my way of thinking about them, maybe that's worth sharing and, seeing how other people feel too. Again, if some of the stuff I'm saying is cool and you agree, awesome. If you disagree with what I'm saying, cool, awesome. Yeah, I'm cool to have some, discussion about it too. Anyway, again, thank you so much. My name's Hsiao, and yeah, these have been my thoughts on vertical harmony. Thank you.